So welcome to today's session, reaching net zero throughout the value chain and how leading companies are aligning with the 1.5 ambition. I'm Johan Falck, I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative. So welcome all digital guests and welcome all guests here at COP27. We are driving something called the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, and we bring together transformers and disruptors taking action in line with the 1.5 ambition to halve emissions by 2030 and doing that through exponential climate action and solutions. We gather today a number of scientific organizations which are part of our initiative, such as the Potsdam Institute of Climate Research, the Stockholm Resilience Center, and many others. We have some of the leading companies as members on a global level, companies that we will hear more from today, such as Ericsson, BT, Google, but also smaller companies, innovation companies like Normative. Our companies represent something like $900 billion in revenue per year, and it's the companies in the absolute forefront. All the members, they are working to implement the strategy in line with the 1.5 ambition that we will talk about today, with a particular focus on value chains. And we basically apply this business playbook as the guideline for all companies, how to set the strategy in line with 1.5. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And this playbook is based on something called the 4-pillar framework. The first pillar is about cutting your own emission, which is absolutely essential for every company, following what we call the carbon law, which means aiming to halve emissions at least every decade, with particular focus on the first halving by 2030. The second pillar is also about halving your value chain emissions. But we also extend it to the third pillar, which is really about providing climate solutions and truly integrate climate and nature as part of all your core strategies. And finally, the fourth pillar, which is really about contributing to global net zero, because basically no company can reach net zero on its own. It has to be done together with your value chain and also society. So to be in line with 1.5, companies should implement a strategy across all these 4 pillars. And that's what we will talk more about. So now I'd like to introduce our excellent panel. Starting with Kristian Rönn, who is CEO and co-founder of Normative. Welcome, Kristian. Emelie, Öhlander, Climate Action Program Manager at Ericsson. And Gabrielle, Environmental Sustainability Principal at BT Group. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great to have you here. Okay, so starting off with you, Emelie. Ericsson was also part of creating this framework and the business playbook some years ago. I think it was 4 years ago. And what was the sort of reason for that, and how do you apply this model in your strategy?
Yeah, I think we saw already, we started to collaborate with you with the Exponential Roadmap that was released during the San Francisco Climate Conference back in 2018, right? We saw then a need for companies do not know about what you actually need to do, work on climate action in all fronts, what you do yourself, how you integrate into your business, looking at the value chain, but also how you impact the social net zero now, or how we impact the society. So that's why we collaborated with you writing this business playbook, and we also saw a need, especially when we are working with our suppliers, because they aren't as big as us, and we need to help them in as many ways as possible.
Great, and it's been a great collaboration, and this playbook have been developed by about 100 different experts and companies, and basically incorporate all the latest standards, which I think is really a key advantage. So let's start to talk a little bit about the pillar 1, just to recap, which is our own emissions, basically our scope 1 and 2 emissions. We call that our own emissions. So over to you, Gabrielle. How do you particularly take action in the first pillar and scope 1 and 2, and your results so far?
Yeah, BT set its first carbon reduction target actually in 1992, and we set our first science-based target in 2008, before people really talking about science-based targets. And that target was to reduce our operational carbon emissions by 80% by 2020. We met that target 4 years ahead of time, so we decided to be even more ambitious. Our targets for net zero are now end of March 2031 for our own operations, and end of March 2041 for our supply chain and customer emissions. And yes, targets are very important, and they've been very important on our journey. But what's more important, and what this COP is a lot about, is around transparency and accountability. So, you know, it's fine having these targets, but how are companies actually doing against those targets? So we're kind of well on our way. We've reduced our emissions again by another 55% since 2016-17 for our operations. But I think, you know, we all need to call for that transparency around how companies are doing.
Great, and I also think an important part of this initiative is actually to show what is achievable, that you can go incredibly fast and learn from the leaders who steal their ideas and steal their recipes, basically. So Emelie, even if you know, the pillar 1 is normally a very small part of the emissions for a company, why is it important, and what have Ericsson achieved?
Yeah, I think for Ericsson, we have a value chain emissions we have around 92% in our downstream scope 3, and that means our products in operations for our amazing customers, because we have customers all over the world. They're also in operations for 10 years. So that is the biggest impact. But we don't stop there. We have around 7.5% in the supply chain, which is also really important for our customers. And then 0.5% in our own activities. And Ericsson have our own activities a bit more like to what the playbook describes. So we have the scope 1 and 2, our direct emissions, but also business travel, and now also commuting incorporated into that, because we feel that that's almost our direct emissions. We can influence them a bit faster. And we, even though it is small, it becomes more and more transparent, because when we set net zero targets, our customers come to us. We are their first tier suppliers. We need to show that we can go faster. And also, if we put requirements on our suppliers, we need to say we can do this, and then hence you can do it. So our approach has been that own activities, even though it's small, we need to lead the way, and we need to lead the way faster than what we actually require our, for example, suppliers to do. And I think for Ericsson, yeah, we have reduced own activities, I think 71% since, I think it was 2016. But then it's also a COVID effect for sure, but it's a lot, I would say 80% of those reductions have been because we have actively worked on reducing this. And now we try to cap it, so we're not going back to the previous pandemic levels. And I think that's important.
Yeah, that's great, and it also shows the potential. If we can get sufficient number of companies actually starting to take action, we can really, really move fast. So I think you're good examples on that. But I'd like to move to the second pillar, which is about the value chain. And when we talk about the value chain, we talk about the upstream, which is, your purchase goods, your supply, but you also talk about the downstream, which is the use of your product and how you actually circulate your product or not circulate your product. So it's both upstream and downstream. So I think I'll start with you, Kristian, and actually ask, why is it so incredibly important to address your value chain emissions, not only your Scope 1 and 2 emissions?
So, there's of course several reasons why it's important to address your Scope 3. First of all, for most businesses, a vast majority of emissions are located in your Scope 3 value chain. For most businesses, more than 90%, and for some businesses, up to 99% of emissions. So you can't really claim to be entirely net zero unless you reduce your Scope 3. But I think also if you take a step back and look at it from a global perspective, there is this huge opportunity, and we actually at Normative did an analysis where we looked at the net zero targets of 1,000 large businesses, and turns out that their internal emissions and Scope 3 is responsible for around 80% of global emissions. So that means that if we can get all of the large enterprises of the world to follow through on their value chain-based commitments, it's a really positive message compared to what we see in the UN emissions gas report, where we're really heading towards 2.8 degrees. But in order to get there, you need the right data and the actionable insights, so you know how to get the most bang for the buck in reducing your Scope 3, which is what we at Normative do as a Pillar 3 solutions provider, but we'll come to Pillar 3 later.
Yes, that's right. Gabrielle, how are you addressing the second pillar, the value chain?
Yeah, so I think similar to what you've just heard. So for BT, again, typical, only 6% of our emissions are Scopes 1 and 2. 71% are our upstream supply chain, and 23% downstream, or customers using our products and services. So if we're ever going to reach net zero, obviously, we need to work on Scope 3. So a few things that we are doing. For example, I spoke earlier about disclosure, so asking our suppliers to disclose their emissions to CDP. We've introduced a contract clause for some of our bigger suppliers, which basically requires the supplier to reduce their emissions over the term of the contract with BT. And that's quite powerful because that elevates the discussion to be a contract negotiation that we can then monitor. And thirdly on that, using our purchasing criteria, right? So we're the customer. 15% of our adjudication criteria is linked to sustainability and human rights. But, of course, I guess, the theme, working with others, collaborating, like what we've been doing on 1.5 supply chain leaders with Ericsson, what we're doing on the SME Climate Hub, because if we are all giving out the same message to our suppliers and to everybody, that's so much more powerful.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think this idea that we can really replicate the same, cascade the same message to your supplier, which will cascade it to their suppliers and so on, then we can get this viral effect over time. If everyone gets on the same compass direction, then it will be much easier. So that should be our target. So Emelie, how are you addressing the second pillar?
Yeah, but I think just to comment on that as well, I think that's why we started the 1.5 degree supply chain leaders, because I think for all of us, especially us in the ICT sector, the supply chain emissions are also harder to actually tackle, both because you don't have the data, that transparency you need, but then the actions, because we have around 20,000 suppliers. And maybe 15,000 of them are SMEs. We need to get that ripple effect. But if you have the data, as we have to some extent, we also know where our hotspots are. We know which suppliers who have the highest emissions, and then we can address them first. So we actually reduce our emissions, giving our SMEs some time to to come on board on this climate journey as well. And I think that's why, we started the supply chain leaders to also put those right requirements on the right suppliers first. And for Ericsson, that is one of the major things we work with in the supply chain. But then because we have around 92% of our emissions downstream in our portfolio in use, we of course focus a lot on energy performance of our product, because that's something that we directly can amplify to our customers, support our customers, but then also we need our customers in that journey. They need to set their own targets, switch to renewables, get down their emissions as well. And we also work quite a lot with standards. And I know today we have a new ISO standard on net zero guidance, which I think is really important. And what is important here, we talked about transparency, is that when we say net zero in the value chain, we mean minimum 90% reduction, right? And I think Business Playbook was a great example of actually almost, I think, putting that first in writing. And now the standards are following after. We have SBTi, and I think the ISO standard now coming out today, they actually want to have 95%. So they only want the residual part about 5%. And they firstly also saying, I think for the first time, a bit more what can be the carbon removal and storage applicable in our net zero transition. So if you have fossil fuel emissions that are residual, you need to permanently store that in the bedrock, geological removals. Like, you can't do bioenergy, some sort of planting trees to actually offtake your fossil fuel emissions. And I think that is something we need to align on those standards, and we need to be putting that forward.
Yeah, that's a great point. It was also part of the purpose of this playbook to actually ensure that we set the key standards, so a company doesn't have to check up 10 or 20 different standards and make their own interpretations. So it's very, in a short format, compile the key standards that companies should follow to be aligned with science, but also with this idea of simplification, not complication. So it's great that we're starting to have a net zero standard, because then we can all relate to that and we can compare companies as well, which is incredibly important. Well, before we move to the third pillar, I'd still like to ask, what do you see as a key challenges, Gabrielle, in the value chain in the pillar 2, which are sort of really quite difficult things that needs to be cracked? That would be interesting.
I think, just to echo what Emelie said, I think because our supply chains are so large, so we have 16,000 suppliers. How do we reach all of them? We can't talk to them all about, setting science-based targets based on a 1.5 degree pathway. So that's why we need the tools like the SME Climate Hub, like the 1.5 Business Playbook. We need to get those messages out there. And I think for all of us, and I guess that's why we're all here, that's the challenge we're trying to tackle. We're trying to get the messages out there.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that. I think, as we know that the ICT industry itself can reduce 80% of our emissions by just moving to renewables, right? Because we have electrification. So I think that's why both for SMEs and large-scale corporations, we need renewables across the world, and that market need to become better. So I think that's really a barrier we can overcome if we take that leap. And it's not the hardest thing you actually need to do, but it is hard because no one is doing that enough.
Yeah. Anything from your side to add to that?
No, I'm happy that both of you are mentioning the SME Climate Hub, and I mean that's the reason why we, together with Exponential Roadmap and the We Mean Business Coalition, started SME Climate Hub to begin with. I mean, most enterprises have this long tail of SMEs in their value chain, and we need some sort of cascading. And you mentioned renewable energy, right? I mean, in the end, if you want to demystify Scope 3, it is just the Scope 1 of your upstream and downstream. And then you need, to get those companies on board and create awareness and clear actions on what they can do to actually decarbonize. And we all need to work together in order for that to happen.
That's great. So SME Climate Hub, I think, is a fantastic resource because we know that large companies might not have the capacity to build up the support for the small companies, so it's a common investment which which all companies can use, and it's free to use for the small companies. So let's move to the third pillar and just recap, which is really about integrating climate nature in your core strategies and also shifting your portfolio to provide solutions which are positive for the climate. Sometimes it could also be related to avoided emissions, which is a bit not so sexy term maybe, but it's called avoided emissions. But we believe it's really important. Well, both we have companies which are qualify as climate solutions companies, and we have a criteria for that. At least 90% of the revenues should be dedicated to such solutions. It's also really important that large companies in a transformation phase start to shift their portfolio to be aligned with 1.5 every single product, going through that transformation. So how are you working because you qualified as a climate solutions company, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the move towards net zero is a real game changer. I mean, for us, we have been around for around a decade, and we help clients account for their carbon footprint and give them actionable insights on how to decrease their footprint. So the solution that we provide is in fact, helping large businesses like Hitachi and Hertz and SEB to manage their carbon footprint. And thus our impact is really, the success of our clients in the end of the day. But what I was about to say is that we're a completely new company. We have grown really fast in the last few years, from 40 to 150 now in only 1 year. So this move towards net zero is a huge opportunity for innovation, and actually for smaller companies to take market shares from the larger players. So I think it's incredibly important that what you do, that you are on top of your innovation, because otherwise you might be too late to the innovation game, and it might be like a Blockbuster when they lost to Netflix in the end of the day. So there's a huge game changer, I think, in pillar 3 overall.
Yeah, and we know that to halve emissions by 2030 and further on, in order to do that, we need to scale up the solutions exponentially and much faster. As you said, in energy, renewable energy, and in regenerative agriculture, and in the circular economy, in every area. So we need that exponential ramping. So it's so incredibly important, and that's why it's part of the framework. So the enablement from the ICT sector also has a high potential. Emelie?
Yeah, it's a great potential. I think Ericsson research showed already back in 2015 that we had the potential with legacy ICT solutions to reduce emissions by 15% by 2030. And that was a high-end scenario. I think with the pandemic, we saw it was really possible. I think Ericsson cut business travel with 85%, and in the scenarios we maybe calculated with 10, the potential is there if you have digitalization. And now when we have 5G, Internet of Things, AI solution, and if we use them right, we can do this. And of course, it's always a responsibility from all of us to do that right, but that's for all technologies. It's neutral. And I think, as you say, Johan, we know that we can do that in all of the sectors. So and we can also buy time, because they are quite cost efficient. You could do it now. You can get those low-hanging fruits out there and reduce emissions. And then we buy time to these hard-to-abate sectors to actually invest, do their pilots, and actually scale other solutions.
Yeah. Gabrielle?
Yeah, I think, digital solutions are going to be key to this transformation that we need to see. So, we are looking at how our solutions are helping customers. We've set a new target to help customers avoid 60 million tons of carbon by 2030. At the moment, 25% of BT revenues are linked, or that's about £5 billion, are linked to products and services that already help customers avoid carbon emissions. But, of course, we're looking at these new technologies, IoT, AI and how they can drive efficiencies in other sectors.
And I think just energy efficiency, which is top on the agenda, there is this tremendous potential with utilization. Could be 20, 30, 40% or even more in factories, in buildings, in machines by applying AI, Internet of Things, and so on. But I guess it's also about scaling out these technologies and ensure that companies can fund them and make really fast investment, right? One thing which we are working on as well is, of course, that in the third pillar, we also need more ways to measure the impact, which is more harmonized, which is really important, because it's quite difficult, also if each company invent their own methods, and it's a risk with that from a communication viewpoint. But also how it's possible to set goals and how to make claims and so on. So we're working with World Business Council for Sustainable Development and some other organizations. We can get also frameworks in place which companies can use, which we think is really important. Any comments from your side, Kristian?
And I think always standardization and frameworks are important to allocate capital in the end of the day. I mean, we have so many technologies that need to be deployed, everything from AI, energy efficiency, renewable energy solutions, sustainable concrete and steel. We of course need the standardization on top of that to know, I mean, how much emissions will we actually reduce from different technologies, and what are the different technological pathways in terms of getting reduction as efficiently as possible. So yeah.
Yes. So finally, let's turn to the fourth pillar, which is about contributing to global society and the global net zero with outside your value chain as true climate leaders. So Gabrielle, how is BT taking action?
So I think one way of doing this is, you know, why businesses are here as well, is we talk about ambition loop or feedback loops with policymakers. So by being ambitious, we as businesses instill confidence in policymakers to be ambitious as well, and then we have that feedback. So, for example, you know, a few years ago, 200 businesses in the UK signed a letter saying that we thought the UK should have a net zero target, and then that happened. And you know, we're looking to do that, for example, on renewable electricity. We're looking to do that on EVs. So just coming together with other companies to influence policy and send demand signals around the world, right? Again, to change markets, to drive that transformation. And of course also, you know, communicating with customers. So that's something that we've been doing, like customer campaigns about how you can reduce energy consumption at home.
That's great, and then you can achieve this 10x or even 100x effect based on what you have achieved, which is incredible.
Yeah, exactly, and you know, we just need, yeah, again, as I've talked about, you know, we just need those others to get on board to drive that shift in global markets.
Emelie.
Yeah, and we have the same. Of course, you know, advocacy for us is really important, both to what we discussed earlier about actually getting the world to know that what decarbonization or digitalization can support within decarbonizing society. But that is also helping our customers realize where the potential is, right? So it almost goes into the pillar 3, as we just discussed, because we know what we can do, but we also need to change our business so we can enable our customers to support society even more. And I think for us, the second thing that has been really important is our work with you, Johan, and Exponential Roadmap Initiative. We have the SME Climate Hub, like all those collaborations to create this, like the idea of doing this snowball effect. We are maybe quite small now, but when we start rolling, you know, we're on the top of the hill, but when we reach the bottom, the snowball would have been really great and big. And I think that's where we need to go. And I think we've started on this momentum. I feel the wind is going a bit more downhill. Yeah,
that's great. And even the carbon law, halving by 2030, was introduced in 2017, and it's basically been pushed 5 years together with you all, and it's sort of now the standard, basically, in UN Race to Zero, Women Business Coalition, and Europe and US. So that potential to scale ideas exponentially also exists. Kristian?
So obviously pillar 4 and working with companies is so core to what we do, and that's the reason why we're here at COP to begin with, and spreading the message that if those 1,000 businesses with net zero targets follow through with them, we can reduce 80% of global emissions. But for that to happen, all of those net zero targets need to have a high level of integrity. And that is not the case today, unfortunately. Most net zero targets lack integrity. And a big part of that is that you need to account for your full carbon footprint. But in order to have that standardized as well, we need to work together to make sure that accounting is standardized in order for the accountability to happen. And we need the right frameworks, which is why we work with you. We need to involve the smaller enterprises in the value chain, which is why we all work with SME Climate Hub, and there's just a bunch of things to do, and the world is an interconnected place, and the reduction of global emissions is the reduction of global value chains, and we all need to be working together for that to happen.
Thanks. So before we open up for some questions, I'd just like to ask if you have any final points or any final messages or reflections. You like to start, Kristian?
There might be a dinosaur here that might be wanting to ask a question.
Yes, please, Freddy the Dino, do you like to... Frankie, sorry about that.
Frankie, do you have a question? Frankie likes the idea of net zero. He says, how are you going to enable people to get to net zero? What's the plan? Thank you.
That's a great question. We certainly don't want to end up like your species. The way we deal with this is that we need to have companies accountable for their net zero targets, and you can't have accountability without having the accurate accounting. So that's how we deal with it from Normative's end.
Yeah, and I think from Ericsson's end, by taking a net zero stand ourselves, we also need our customers to go toward net zero, our suppliers, even though maybe we just start with scope 1 and 2 firstly to really account for our emissions, but creating that, it's again the snowball effect, right? As more people you talk to, more companies, you create that, and also for us showing national authorities that we can do this, like businesses want to take stand. I think that can also push the agenda forward, because they need to take better care of our planet.
Gabrielle?
Yeah, and I think just building on that, we're trying to lead by example. We're trying to show what is possible through purchasing of renewable electricity, through moving on with our value chains, and we're hoping that if we can do it, others will feel inspired to do it and start their journey. And this is a great way to start it through the playbook.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, I think. Everyone can download. This is an open resource. It sets a standard for what is absolutely best practice for every company. And it's just one example of that we need to share best practices openly. We need to work together. We need to get every company on the same compass direction, and just that make everyone understand that it's about to become competitive or staying in business. So I think that is our common task. Work together and get everyone on the same compass direction. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.